Many of you will be joining us dry, but there is also an option to join us via a set of tasting samples. So if you've received them in time, this is what they will look like. And what I'll ask you is to get some identical glasses. Ideally, you will get 3 glasses to join us for this presentation. The bare minimum is 2. Even better is 11, so you can pour all the samples in advance, but 3 of them will do just fine. As long as they're identical, it's perfect. Doesn't matter what the size is, doesn't matter if they're large glasses or if they are small glasses. So I'll introduce myself. My name is Sietse. I'm from the Netherlands, and the name of my company is The Art of Tasting. I'm the founder of it. I give tasting courses using a unique method that we'll use today as well. So I give these classes online, but also in person. And I have a master in sensory science being the study of flavor perception. I did this at the University of Wageningen. I have my level 4 diploma in wines from the Wine and Spirit Education Trust, and I'm also an advanced Cicerone. And Cicerone is basically the beer version of a sommelier, so I know a thing or two about beer as well. Now let's go ahead and talk about what a wine fault is. So this is an undesirable flavor in wine, a flavor that typically detracts from quality. What you'll find out is that for each wine fault, there might be some styles where that is actually considered a positive or a desirable character, whereas in other styles that will be considered a wine fault. So it's dependent on the wine style, but also at the intensity, so the level that you will find the fault. And we'll discuss that for each of the 10 wine faults that we'll talk about today. And if you are joining us with the tasting kit, go ahead and pour your reference wine and also pour glass number 1. And that glass number 1 is the smell of wet cardboard. And I've added a compound to this wine, and it's called TCA, which is short for trichloroanisole. I'll get into the origins of this in a little bit, but let's talk about what that smells like. This is a wine that smells like wet cardboard. Very much damp or wet. There's something moldy about this. Damp cellar being another commonly used attribute. What this chart shows is the descriptors of 20 different wine tasters that have given a description on what they think cork taint smells like, which is the first wine fault that we'll be discussing today. And then what you see is the majority of the tasters, so over 50%, agree on that descriptor wet cardboard. And similarly, damp cellar. And then moldy, musty, attic, old washing, and thrift store are some other descriptors that are commonly used for this particular flavor. A thrift store being like a second-hand clothing store. And if you're joining us, please smell the wine, number 1, and also give it a taste. Of course, tasting faulty wines might not be the most pleasant thing there is, but it's a very valuable learning experience, because you'll experience that some of these faults are much more noticeable on the palate and others are more noticeable on the nose. So it's a useful exercise. So the way that these samples are built up, there are 11 of them, all based on the same neutral white wine. But the twist is that to the numbered samples, numbered 1 to 10, I've added a single aromatic compound, which is depicted here. So I'm doing an addition here of TCA, which makes the wine cork tainted pretty much. So let's talk about where cork taint comes from. And this is probably one of the most famous wine faults. And these days, it's estimated that 1 in 100 wine bottles that are fitted with a natural cork can develop cork taint. So we're looking at an incidence percentage of 1%, which used to be much higher in the past. The moldy descriptor is because it is indeed produced by molds. It's important to be aware of this because there's a lot of different microbes that are involved in the production of wine, including yeast during alcoholic fermentation and bacteria during malolactic fermentation. But molds usually don't belong in wine. And actually, they can't tolerate alcohol at all. So that is different from yeast and bacteria that can actually grow in wine. And with molds, that's not the case. So whenever we're smelling this wet cardboard aroma, it's always an indication that it has picked it up from the outside environment. Okay, it doesn't develop in wine itself. It must be picked up from another source. And that other source is usually the cork. And if you trace all the way where that aroma comes from, we know that it's related to chlorine. And I'm going to jump onto this plot, which neatly shows you the origin of this flavor. We know that cork is derived from cork trees, and cork trees are mostly grown in Portugal and so some in Spain. So that's where a lot of the cork production comes from, okay? And in the growing environment, it's very common to use biocides. So biocides are herbicides, pesticides, and they typically contain chlorine. So that's what's showing on the top left here on the screen. What happens is that those chlorine components of biocides are being pulled up by the tree via the roots, and they end up in the bark, and that's where they react with phenolic compounds that are present in the cork bark. That reaction results in something called TCP. So TCP is short for trichlorophenol. It's actually also a commercial product. Maybe you've used it before. It's an antiseptic. So antiseptic tells us it is effective against microbes, and actually it's indeed toxic to molds. And what molds do, they turn TCP into TCA in order to get rid of that toxicity. Okay, so this is a defense mechanism of molds. So this is a lot of different steps, and it's quite detailed. But I think the bottom line of this is that this wine fault, cork taint, is actually a man-made flavor if you think about it. Because if there wouldn't be any use of biocides, then you wouldn't get any traces of chlorine, and you wouldn't get that wet cardboard smell as a result. So it's interesting to think about it like that. This is a wine fault that used to be much higher in the past. So if you're looking at data from the 90s, the cork taint presence was more around 8%, so 8 in 100 bottles. That's a lot higher. Back in the day, chlorine was also used as a bleaching agent in the production of corks, so to kind of reduce the intensity of the dark color of those corks. And those traces of chlorine then also became cork taint as they were exposed to molds. Okay, so these days they swapped the bleaching agent to a non-chlorine containing bleaching, which results in pretty much, a lot less cork taint than in the past. And of course, the advent of screw caps also means that the incidence of cork taint is dramatically reduced. So that's one of the advantages you get from cork alternatives. And we also see cork alternatives, such as technical corks. These are usually composed of small granules, so small cork granules that are individually cleaned first and then put together using a glue or adhesive. And when you use those corks, you also dramatically reduce the incidence of TCA or cork taint. Now, we've also improved these techniques into that whole, like, natural pieces of cork can also be cleaned that way, but initially it was used using the technical corks that are also known as agglomerated corks, so like consisting of many individual cork fragments. So let's talk about the detection thresholds. And what I'm showing in each of those slides is the detection threshold on the right of the slide. So that gives you an indication of how sensitive humans are to that particular aroma compound. Now, a detection threshold is defined as the minimum quantity of an aroma compound that must be present before it can be smelled, so before it starts to give off an aroma. And on the right here, we're talking about the unit of ng, which is short for nanograms. And nanogram, you might not be familiar with it. I think a more familiar type of unit is the milligram, and 1 milligram is more or less a sugar granule. So that's already a pretty low concentration. But a nanogram is a millionth of a milligram. So we're looking at a millionth of a sugar granule, basically, that's present in this glass that completely taints the wine. And it tells us that we are highly sensitive to some of those faulty wine aroma compounds, including TCA. Another way to put it is to convert it to a volume percentage. Now, this is a wine with about 12% alcohol, but the alcohol itself is not so noticeable. The volume percentage of TCA, however, is a ridiculously low percentage, 0.0, a lot of zeros, 3%. And that indeed tells us that we are highly sensitive to this. And we're maybe, as humans, not so sensitive to the smell of alcohol, interestingly. Okay. Now, if you're joining us with the tasting kit, please keep your reference wine. So don't get rid of that. Get rid of your wet carb, so your cork tainted wine, and that will leave you hopefully with 2 empty glasses. And then you'll go ahead with pouring sample number 2 and 3. Okay. So while we do that, I'm showing an empty slide here because if you're watching this later from a video recording from YouTube, for example, and you're tasting along, you can also pause the video here and try to work out what the flavor is. But just to keep the pace up a little bit for this webinar, I'm going to show what this glass number 2 is. And that is the bruised apple aroma of the compound acetaldehyde. And once again, you're getting different descriptors here because this is not only an aroma compound that you find in wine, but it's also present in so many other sources in nature. But mostly apples, bruised apples, like an apple with a brown spot, definitely has this aroma. It's also reminiscent of paint. So there's like that paint thinner almost smell about it. Pumpkin, indeed, so a sliced pumpkin, the inside of the pumpkin actually has the same smell. The dough, green apple, sliced papaya. I was recently talking with a sommelier from South Africa, and he really reminded this of marula fruits. So that's a specific native fruit to, well, many parts of Africa. But everyone has their own connections to certain aromas. So really what I'm showing you here are different options that you could describe the same aroma compounds. Acetaldehyde is an oxidation aroma. So number 2 and 3 are related in the sense that they're both oxidation-derived aromas. And oxidation is basically the principle of the exposure of air, which consists partly of oxygen, to wine. And that results in a range of reactions. Now, when you're looking at the compound acetaldehyde specifically, it can also be formed during fermentation. So if you look at origins, there's 2 distinct origins of this, right? Fermentation as well as oxidation. And let's start with fermentation, because acetaldehyde is what we call an intermediate compound in the production of alcohol. Now, you'll have some prior wine knowledge, so you'll know that during alcoholic fermentation, yeast consumes sugar and turns it into alcohol. But acetaldehyde, being the intermediate compound, means that in simple steps, sugar is converted to acetaldehyde, then acetaldehyde is converted to alcohol. That tells us that when a wine smells of bruised apple, it's an indication that fermentation is not fully completed yet. Okay, yeast is still in that process of doing that conversion from sugar to alcohol. And there can be multiple reasons for that. Sometimes it is intentional to stop the fermentation early. For example, if your intention is to have a wine with some residual sugar. It could also be that maybe as a winemaker, you don't have the patience to wait 2 weeks until fermentation is completed, but you'd rather rush your wine onto the market and produce it as fast as possible, resulting in greater economic profits. But sometimes a fermentation can also get stuck and it will be unintentional. And that it can be because the yeast has stopped fermenting because it was not in a healthy state. And you're also getting increased levels of acetaldehyde. There's a specific yeast strain that's known to produce high levels of acetaldehyde, and that is floor yeast. So key in the development of and the production of sherry. And indeed, when you're smelling this glass, it might also remind you of a Fino sherry, which is always very high level, high in acetaldehyde. And in that case, it wouldn't be considered a fault. Instead, it's considered one of the key characters of that wine style. So it would be considered a positive flavor. Now let's talk about oxidation as well, because at any point when wine is exposed to oxygen, it will also increase in acetaldehyde because it's the direct oxidation product of alcohol. Let me give you 2 examples. One of them would be when you're fermenting in a fermentation vessel that's not fully filled. So there's some space in there in that tank, resulting in higher acetaldehyde. Another example is when you're leaving your wine open for too long after you've bought it and you've pulled the cork and you leave it open, then acetaldehyde levels will increase as a result of oxygen exposure. So in summary, a wine starts its life being very high in acetaldehyde, and then normally it drops off to a level that's not noticeable. And then later in its life, acetaldehyde levels rise again, and that bruised apple will become noticeable. I'll just mention SO2 sulfur dioxide here as well. We'll talk about that a bit more about the other wine faults. It's very effective at preventing certain faults because, one, it prevents against oxidation, and second, it has antimicrobial activity. So it's very effective against preventing wild yeasts and sorts. Okay? Detection threshold is a fair bit higher than TCA, so we are comparatively less sensitive to this aroma compound. So let's go on to sample number 3. Once again, you can pause your video, but I am just going to crack on here. This is the smell of brown sugar. Very interesting aroma compound because, once again, there's no one-size-fits-all descriptor. So brown sugar is the term that we agreed on that most people can relate to. But then look at the other descriptors: Maggi sauce, caramel, curry powder. So there's something sweet about this, but also something savory at the same time. The curry powder descriptor is because the compound that we're talking about in sample number 3 is called sotalon, and it is a component of fenugreek seeds. And in turn, fenugreek seeds are an ingredient of curry powder. So in fact, sometimes fenugreek seeds are used to make maple syrup or caramel syrup alternatives because it shares some similar aroma compounds. Soy sauce, walnut being some other descriptors that this can remind you of. Also present on the palate. So another oxidation compound, but in contrast to acetaldehyde, which is the previous aroma we talked about, acetaldehyde, so the bruised apple smell, can also be formed during fermentation, but sotalon can't, okay? So yeast doesn't produce it. It is strictly an oxidation compound. And when I'm giving these classes, people frequently ask me, why is this a fault? Because this smells pleasant. And I think that's a pretty valid question. And indeed, this is usually considered a more pleasant characteristic, but you need to put this into context. So for example, if you're a winemaker and you're in New Zealand, you're making Sauvignon Blanc, and your wine smells of brown sugar, then you've got a big problem, okay? Nobody's going to buy your wine. Why not? Because people have a certain expectation of a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. They expect it to be really fresh. They expect it to be fruity and floral. They don't want any dull flavors such as brown sugar, which would really take away from drinkability. Okay, so yes, this is a positive in certain wines, but in many of them, in many wines that are available to consumers, this is unacceptable as an aroma. Okay, so we'll talk about some of the factors that determine oxidation, and to talk about that, I'll use the concept of premature oxidation, which you might have heard of before. It famously got a lot of attention during the 90s because some white wines from Burgundy were showing some very developed notes very early on, much before they were supposed to. So in other words, some white wines after 2 or 3 years were turning brown. They were showing all these aromas like bruised apple, brown sugar, caramel, or oxidized notes, whereas in the ideal circumstances, these wines would actually hold for 10 years or more. So that was known as premature oxidation. So really a wine that was developing way too fast. And there are several factors that determine that. So let's talk about tannins. We know that red wines are better protected than white wines against oxidation because of its high tannin levels. Okay, they protect against oxygen. Acidity, that too. So the higher the acidity, the better the protection against oxygen. Now, in the 90s, when there were a lot of oxidized wines, acidity levels were already dropping because of warmer conditions due to climate change. And you'll know that warmer conditions lead to lower acidity levels in grapes, okay? So less protection against oxygen. Sulfur dioxide use, there is a trend these days to use less sulfur dioxide. That already started in the 90s. And indeed, lower sulfur dioxide levels can result in faster oxidation. Bottle closures weren't maybe the highest quality at the time. These days, we're seeing a lot better quality bottle closures, and that, of course, is key to sealing your wine of any oxygen exposure. I'm just going to look at the chat in the meantime, see if there's any questions. If I'm missing any during the presentation, then at the end of the presentation, I'm happy to go through the chat and look at presentation as well. Threshold here is in the range of micrograms. Micrograms are in between milligrams and nanograms, so we're medium sensitive to this particular aroma compound. So I'll ask you to pick up these glasses 2 and 3, so those are the bruised apple and the brown sugar, and just mix them together briefly and give that a smell, and that gives a really good representation of what a wine smells like that was left open for too long. Okay, so there's 2 oxidation aromas at the same time. Let's discuss. I find this very useful to divide faults into taints and off flavors. Taint, we've already talked about cork taint, which is a great example of it. A taint is always coming from the outside environment. Okay, so it's like an intruder to wine. It's a contaminant. An off flavor, that is a wine flavor that's actually a normal component in wine, and it's present in all wines, but it becomes a problem at high levels. And acetaldehyde, the bruised apple smell, is a great example of that. It is present in all wines because yeast makes it, but in most wine styles, it's not noticeable because it's present at a very low level and you don't notice it. Okay, so off flavors present in all wines, but a problem at high levels. Taints do not belong in wine ever. Okay, TCA is not something that yeast will ever produce. It does not belong in wine at any level. So if your samples 2 and 3, still keep your reference, and we're going to pour the glass number 4. Which is the smell of camembert. Oh dear, look at these descriptors. Rubbish bin, vomit, spoiled meat. This is definitely something very undesirable. As you can tell from these descriptors, you can probably get an impression of what that would smell like. So let's look at what the compound is called. It's called methyl mercaptan. And this is mercaptan. You can always tell that it's a sulfur compound. And then on the right side of this slide, there's also the structural formula. Sulfur compound. And this particular compound is associated with 2 faults, namely reduction and light strike. And let's talk about reduction first. Reduction is a wine fault that can attribute it to yeast stress. And when I say yeast stress, it means that yeast is not happy with its fermentation conditions. And usually that is because it's lacking certain nutrients. And we're specifically talking about nitrogen here. Nitrogen is something that's present in the soil. So vines can actually pull that up via the roots, and that nitrogen ends up in the grapes. And usually that's a sufficient source for yeast to ferment in a healthy manner. But sometimes when you're growing vines on very poor soils, for example, the nitrogen supply might not be enough to the grapes. And that will have an effect on the yeast later on. And if it's lacking that, it will start to produce that camembert aroma. The way that you can think about this is, yes, yeast is famous for turning sugar into alcohol, but it needs other nutrients along the way. And in that sense, it's not so different from humans. So humans also need sugar as their energy source. But if you would have a diet of just sugar, say you have it for a week, I think at the end of the week, you'll still be alive, but you wouldn't feel well at all. And yeast is the same. So it can't live off just sugar. Okay. And if it's lacking nitrogen, it will look for different sources. And that sources is this particular amino acid called cysteine. Amino acids are present in all foods, including grapes. And cysteine does not have any aroma or flavor by itself, but as you can tell from its composition, there's an N there, which is indicative of nitrogen. So that's what the yeast is after. But then on the left, there's also that S, okay? And we know that that is a sulfur element. Now, yeast will start attacking this molecule. So it will basically fall apart, freeing up the nitrogen. So yeast is happy with that. But it also frees up this S and the H. That will initially become something called hydrogen sulfide, which smells of boiled eggs and rotten eggs. and that later reacts to form the camembert smell. So in reductive wine, you're typically getting some aromas at the same time, such as boiled eggs and camembert. Oxygen plays a massive role here. So if yeast is also lacking oxygen, then this problem becomes much worse. Okay, so if you're being very, very restrictive with how much oxygen you're introducing to your wine, then this problem can get worse. Consequently, bottle closures also play a role here. So sometimes screw cap wines can show this more than cork fitted wines, because cork will show that little bit of oxygen ingress, and that can actually reverse some of the sulfur compounds that yeast have produced. Yeah. So the good news is there's actually some remedies here. So oxygen exposure in the form of decanting, for example, can indeed alleviate some of those sulfur compounds. That works best with the hydrogen sulfide compounds. So if your wine smells of boiled eggs, then that is a pretty effective remedy, and you can get rid of that. It also works with some of the compounds like the camembert smell, but to a slightly lesser extent. This is pretty unique for wine faults. So most wine faults don't get better as the result of decanting. So you can decant a cork-tainted wine as many times as you want, but it will never lose the wet cardboard smell. But with reduction, yeah, there's something you can do. Copper is another way that you can actually reduce some of these sulfur compounds. Copper reacts with sulfur to reduce the aroma. The poor news is, though, that it also reacts with some of the positive sulfur compounds in wine. So there's also some of those compounds that are desirable. Let's move on to number 5. So let's talk about the aroma of smoke. And what it tells us when a wine smells of smoke is that it is smoke tainted. This can remind you of an array of smoky products, including smoked bacon, smoked meat, smoked cheese, smoked chi, like lapsang souchong, if that's familiar to you, smoked whiskey, like whiskeys from the Isle of Islay, smell like this. There's also a plasticky note to this, almost like molten plastic. Toothpaste can have this compound as an ingredient. There's also notes of clove and vanilla here as sort of background notes. But overall, this smells very smoky. Smoke taint occurs when there's a wildfire in the vicinity of your vineyard. So from that fire, you'll always have a lot of smoke development. And if you're unlucky, that smoke will travel into the vineyard, blanketing vines. And then if there are grapes ripening at the same time, they will absorb that smoke aroma. This is a problem that you can imagine is getting worse because wildfires are increasingly prevalent in the face of climate change. And there's a lot of regions that have been affected recently, California, but also in Australia, for example, Portugal. You're getting these wildfires, and of course it can have other consequences beyond winemaking. But the grape growers had a real challenge with managing this aroma. This is mostly a fault in red wines because the smoke aroma attaches to the grape skins. So when you're making white wine, it is indeed possible, even if in the event of a wildfire, to make a clean, sound wine from your grapes. If you are using your grapes in a very gentle, so if you're adopting very gentle grape processing. And the way to think about this is managing your grapes in a way that you would do when you're making champagne, for example. So you're picking whole bunches, you're using very gentle pressing, and that will release a very subtle juice that can indeed not have the smoke flavor because you're getting rid of the skins. If you want to make red wine, what most winemakers will do is first check how serious the smoke aroma is. It is pretty tricky to check it because even so, after the smoke has disappeared from your vineyard and you're tasting your grapes, the smoke aroma is not immediately present. So your grapes will taste fine because the smoke aroma attaches to certain sugar groups that are present in the grapes. and that makes it in such a form that you actually can't smell the smoke aroma. So it's a very tricky one to manage. What winemakers would do is they will use a couple of the bunches and then ferment a small part of the harvest in a sense. So use a couple of bunches, ferment it, expose it to heat, so kind of force the aging and force the smoke aroma out. Then they will check that small batch for any smoke aroma, and if it's free of smoke aroma, they then proceed with the rest of the harvest, if that makes sense. Now, if you do find a smoke aroma in your small batch, there is still a technique you can apply, which is called flash détente. It's a way to expose your grapes to some heat, resulting in a faster extraction of color and flavor, but also getting rid of some of those smoke aromas. There's also the technique of reverse osmosis that's also used in the production of alcohol-free wines. So it's a way to selectively remove some compounds from wine. And all of these techniques are kind of medium effective. Usually they're combined, and that will result in a wine that you could potentially sell. But also keep in mind that any of those techniques will also strip away some positive aromas of the wine itself. I was talking with an Australian wine educator the other day, and he said that in the 2020 vintage, this problem was particularly bad. So huge areas of wine that were affected by smoke taints. They used that wine, however, to distill it into a hand sanitizer. So that's another way that you can still get some money value out of your wines, even if they smell of smoke. So they distilled it, and it came in handy because it was a COVID pandemic at the time. So then at least, well, everyone needed hand sanitizer. Interestingly, when that hand sanitizer was used, it would still smell of smoke. Okay, your hands would smell like smoke. So that's how persistent the problem is. It can be pretty serious. Smoke taints. Okay. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to skip this. This 2, and we're going to go to sample number 6. And I'll ask you to pour 6 and 7 actually in separate glasses. So you'll still have your reference wine, and you'll have your glass number 6, and you'll have your glass number 7. So you'll have already thrown away number 4 and 5. Number 6 smells of Band-Aid. The compound is called 4-EP, short for 4-ethyl-phenol. Again, you wouldn't think that Band-Aid and blue cheese have anything in common at all, but if I'm smelling this, I can kind of relate to both. Barnyard, so there's also something animal-like about this. Some related terms to those are leather, washed rind cheese, sheep's wool. Peat is another descriptor here you could use for this pretty interesting aroma compound that shows itself in so many ways. This is a compound that is produced by Brettanomyces, which is a type of wild yeast. So we'll refer to it as Brett. It's called a wild yeast because it is never something that a winemaker would add to wine by itself, but it's always an intruder. So it's a type of yeast that will come into the winery and then co-ferment. So it will ferment along the normal type of yeast and then introduce all these questionable aromas that you don't really associate with normal yeast, so normal alcohol, the conventional yeast, I will call it. There's actually also a scientific name for that type of yeast, which I'll show here. So on top is the Saccharomyces cerevisiae. That is the conventional type of yeast that always carries out your alcoholic fermentation. And then on the bottom is Brettanomyces. Now, in order to understand the difference between these, the key difference here is speed. And you can almost compare them as if they were runners. And Saccharomyces is more like a sprinter. Brettanomyces is more like a marathon runner. So Saccharomyces is very, very fast. Brettanomyces is slower, but its endurance is much better. So it can hold for much longer. It can live on and sustain, and also live off of very little nutrients. So these are the two. Yeah, these are important differences between the two. And Brett is something we associate with red wine more than white wine. And there's a couple of reasons for that. So first, it likes to hide in a wooden barrel. And oak casks are more commonly used in red wines than white wines. Also, sulfur dioxide is more effective in white wines because of their higher acidity. That is quite effective against bread. Then also 4EP, so this Band-Aid smell, is derived from a compound you find more in the skins. So any skin contact, which is default by red wines, you'll get a greater incident or greater likelihood of that production of the Band-Aid aroma from Brettanomyces yeast. We'll also talk about fermentation, because this is so much more common if you're carrying out an ambient fermentation versus a fermentation where you're using cultured yeast. So cultured yeast is quite common. It's simply purchasing your yeast from a laboratory, you add it to your wine, very reliable. 2 weeks later, you'll have wine. But the other way to do it is just relying on ambient yeast from the winery environment. And then there's a greater chance that Brettanomyces will also ferment part of that juice. Okay. Incidentally, bread is also seen in a bottle. And in that case, you will also see some haze appearing in the wine, because this is a type of yeast that is not very flocculent. And what it means is it tends to float in wine, okay? So it can cause a haze if it's fermenting in a bottle. So there's a couple of ways to prevent bread, and we'll talk about that in a bit later, because first I'm gonna go on to sample number 7 and try that too, because this is a compound that is related. Okay, I have seen there's a question that popped up about smoke aroma, so I'll just finish what I have to say about bread, and then I'll go back to that. The smell of vomit, okay, so much different than the Band-Aid smell. Sweaty socks, damp cloth, and cheese, particularly Parmesan cheese, is how I would describe this particular aroma. And this is also produced by bread. And the reason I'm showing 2 different bread aromas is that there's not just a single bread smell, okay? It can show itself in different ways. And that is because bread there's not just a single strain of bread, but just like there's different grape varieties, there's also different bread varieties. So what bread looks like in Australia, for example, that might be quite different from what it looks like in France. And they've indeed done some DNA tests. And then those bread strains are kind of different, and they produce all these aromas. So some of the famous aromas are the vomit one, the Band-Aid one, and also the leather one from 4EG. It will produce those in various proportions depending on its DNA, but also depending on which grape variety it will ferment in. So a Pinot Noir, which is bread affected, will smell slightly different from a Cabernet Sauvignon, for example, that is bread affected. So it's useful to keep that in mind. Now, how can we prevent bread? There's a very interesting read called Postmodern Winemaking, which is from a gentleman called Clark Smith, and he has some very interesting things to say about bread. And he says there's basically 2 types of winery. One, where they know they have bread, and the other type of winery where they have bread and they don't know. So basically what he's saying is bread is everywhere, and it's difficult to control it. It's best to accept that it's in your winery, and then the approach is to make sure that bread has nothing to work with. And you'll achieve that by taking very good care of your residual sugar. Any residual sugar in your wine will predispose bread formation. Yeast nutrients too, because if there's some leftover nutrients that Saccharomyces didn't use, then bread can use those and then produce some of the bread-associated flavors. So this is a tricky balance for a winemaker. Too little nutrients, and you can get the reduction flavors, such as the camembert smell we talked about, glass number 4. But too many of them, and you predispose a wine to bread. And then Clark Smith also advocates using cultured yeast rather than ambient fermentations. And then sulfur dioxide is, as mentioned, a very effective tool against preventing bread formation. So that's what I'll have to say about bread. And the question that I received here is, how can you difference the smoke aroma as a fault coming from aging in oak That is a good question. I actually have a slide for that, so I'm going back a couple. It's the one that I skipped, but let's talk about it anyway. So this plot shows you some guaiacol levels, and guaiacol is that aroma compound in smoke tainted wines, right? So this shows some guaiacol levels in different wines. So if you're having an unoaked wine, you will not notice any smoke aroma, as is the case with you're having an oak wine, but it's subjected to a light toast. So if you're using a heavy toast barrel, actually, yes, you can notice that smoke aroma coming through, and it's the same aroma compound as the smoke taint. The smoke tainted wine is depicted here, much higher quantities. For reference, this is that glass number 5, so the smoke tainted example that I'm using in this glass, sort of medium smoke taint, I guess. So in this case, usually it's much better integrated. It's not just smoke aroma. And also keep in mind that oak casks give off other aromas at the same time, such as vanilla, coconut, chocolate, for example. So that smoke aroma will go hand in hand with some of those aromas, and then it will be much more pleasant. Whereas this is like, it's just smoke. It smells kind of ash, and it's just not very pleasant at all. Okay, let's go. We were at 6 and 7. Just mix them together if you're tasting along, and then have a smell of that mixture of 6 and 7. So that's the Band-Aid and the vomit smell. And that actually gives you a pretty good representation of bread, what bread smells like in real life. So this is a bit more authentic of a bread smell, if that makes sense. Now, after you've tried that, get rid of it, and you'll have 2 glasses freed up, allowing you to pour number 8 and number 9. Wonderful. Number 8 is the smell of vinegar. Almost it smells sour in a way, which is interesting because sour is actually one of the basic taste sensations, not something that you could typically smell, but this is something that we have associated with that taste sensation. Vinegar, cider, kombucha, pickles, and salad dressing. There's also something pungent about this glass. It's almost like, as a reflex, I'm sort of bouncing back. It's as if there's someone poking in my nose with a feather, if that makes sense. That's what this aroma compound does as well. And the compound is called acetic acid. And this is the main component of volatile acidity, which is sometimes also called VA for short. Volatile acidity is a wine fault, which is caused by bacteria. So we've already talked about yeast, and bacteria behave a little bit differently, specifically this type, which actually requires oxygen to grow. That is different from, say, lactic acid bacteria that carry out the malolactic fermentation. They don't need access to oxygen, but acetic bacteria do. So what that tells us, if your wine smells of vinegar, there's 2 problems. The first is exposure to oxygen, and then the second one is there's an hygiene issue because there's these bacteria growing that you don't want in your wine. Now, that is of course managed by preventing oxygen, and there's many different steps in winemaking where this can become a problem, starting as soon as in the vineyard. So if your grapes are damaged, for example, as a result of a hailstorm, there's hail damaging your grapes, there's birds maybe eating away your grapes, or certain insects that can make a puncture in the grape skin, that can already lead to vinegar smell developing. Will simply be those bacteria fermenting, and you could already smell that if you're walking through the vineyard, and you'll have that problem. Sometimes that's called sour rot. Okay, so the grapes will start to rot and release this vinegar smell. So that's the first step, really, where this can develop. Also, in transport of grapes during to the winery after harvest, if you're not careful, if you're not cooling, if you're not paying attention that those grapes are crushed during transport, you can already get a little bit of that vinegar character developing. During fermentation, yeast will produce small quantities of that vinegar aroma but always in a concentration that you don't really notice it. So yeast is usually not the problem cause when vinegar levels are anywhere near this. And actually, some acetic acid is beneficial because it can further react to form some pleasant fruity aroma. So a little bit of acetic acid is usually considered desirable, but you don't want anywhere near the levels as this. During aging, you can get increased levels of acetic acid. During oak aging, what some winemakers still use like traditional principles where they're using a lot of oak, very extended aging, and then if you're not topping up your barrels, some of the wine will actually evaporate through the cask, resulting in a headspace or a space of air above the wine, and that air can actually nurture those acetic acid bacteria and then result in a vinegar smell. So really, it's the onset of your wine turning into vinegar, and commercial vinegar, like balsamic vinegar, is indeed 5% acetic acid, so it's a very high level. If you convert this in volume percentage, so the addition I did here is around 1 gram per liter, so that's maybe like 0.1%, something like that. So not anywhere near the levels that you find in actual vinegar, but it's the onset of the vinegar forming. The source of those bacteria, or the fuel, I should say, is alcohol. So there needs to be some alcohol, which is then converted into acetic acid by bacteria. Let's move on to, actually I'll show this this slide. I just mentioned the stinging character of this smell as well, and that is perceived through the trigeminal nerve, which is shown on this kind of creepy picture, but it nicely shows that the trigeminal nerve has like 3 branches which runs through the face, and it has several functions. One of them is the operation of facial muscles, for example, but the trigeminal nerve can also pick up some aroma sensations that don't quite fit into the senses of smell and taste. And that stinging sensation of acetic acid is an example of that. And then you'll also find these familiar, the warming effect of alcohol in your throat when you're drinking wine. The heat from chili, that is also perceived through the trigeminal nerve. And a couple more examples here. So even if you, for whatever reason, don't have a sense of smell because you have COVID, for example, or you have some other condition, or you don't have the sense of taste, then this system will still be active, okay? So you will still perceive all of these sensations, even if you have a cold or if you otherwise don't have a sense of smell. This, I'll skip this for now. Let's go to sample number 9. Pardon me if there's any background noise. I think it shouldn't be audible because of my microphone, but just in case there's something. Sample 9 is the smell of nail varnish remover. And the compound is called ethyl acetate. And it is indeed, ethyl acetate is sometimes used in nail varnish remover. There's basically 2 types of solvent. The one is called acetone, the other one is called ethyl acetate. But ethyl acetate is the compound that is found in wine too. So that's the one that I've added here and we'll talk about. Glue, another very useful descriptor. Pear is another interesting one as well. There's something fruity about this, and indeed this is a compound that belongs to the category of esters, so the class of esters. And some other esters found in wine can actually cause some of the fruity nuances in wine. So yeah, there's a small hint of fruitiness here as well. And the vinegar smell and nail varnish remover belong together. They're both part of this volatile acidity, and they occur together because when alcohol reacts with acetic acid, it becomes ethyl acetate. So an ester is always a combination of an alcohol and an acid. And in this case, it's the alcohol from wine and the acetic acid. So that's the vinegar smell, glass number 8. So those 2 together become ethyl acetate. So that means that when your wine smells of that vinegar smell, it will also smell of that nail varnish remover smell at the same time. So similarly, you're trying to avoid the growing conditions that favor acetic acid bacteria, and that should usually do the trick. This is a flavor that can potentially also be formed by yeast. So yeast has enzymes that favor the production of esters. So in some conditions, when yeast is stressed, for example, it can produce a bit more of that ethyl acetate, combining the acetic acid, so the vinegar smell, and the alcohol smell at the same time. But usually these two will go hand in hand. Now it's interesting that this is called volatile acidity because, strictly speaking, this is not an acid. It's only the vinegar smell that's an acid. So let's get some definitions out of the way. So when you're looking at acids specifically, there's the volatile acids, of which acetic acid is the main one, pictured on the left. And then there's the non-volatile acids. And malic acid is a really famous grape acid present in all wines, contributing to a sour taste. When acids are volatile, they're usually very small. So if you're looking at that molecule, it's a really small size. It will also mean it's very lightweight and it can evaporate easily. That allows us that it's being picked up by smell. The non-volatile acids on the right are much larger molecules and they're much more heavyweight. That means that they will not escape wine, so they won't evaporate. They can only ever be picked up by the sense of taste. Okay, they will never be able to reach our nose. And volatile acidity is not really like, we're not talking about acids in specific, but it's just a sensory impression of those acidity associated aromas, if that makes sense. So from a chemical viewpoint, volatile acidity is a bit different than from the sensory viewpoint, if that makes sense. So we're using the sensory viewpoint here. Another way to bring out this aroma is a neat little trick, which looks like this. Basically, you can cover up the glass with your hands like this. Use the palm of your hand, and then you'll swirl for a couple of seconds. That works pretty well with the ethyl acetate, so the nail varnish remover aroma in particular. So you'll remove your hand and at the same time take a long 2-second sniff, like this, really amplifying that nail varnish remover smell. What's your opinion on these aromas 8 and 9 in natural wine? Is a question that comes up in the chat. In my opinion, I really enjoy natural wine as long as you don't identify it as such, if that makes sense. So, in my opinion, natural wine should be clean, and there's no place for these aromas in natural wine. But that's just a personal opinion, and I know there's other people that can enjoy aromas such as vinegar and nail varnish remover to some extent in some wines, and they find that it brings some kind of freshness to these wines. So yeah, it's really a matter of opinion. It is true that these are seen more often in natural wines, and that is because natural fermentations can also allow some bacteria to ferment. It can allow some wild yeast to ferment, and these microbes are just a bit more likely to produce these aromas such as acetic acid and ethyl acetate. So indeed, it's much more common in these wine styles. I'm not a fan of it per se myself. And similarly with the bruised apple smell, indeed, it is relatively common for a winemaker to do some nitrogen additions during fermentation to make sure that everything is healthy and you're avoiding smells like the reduction smells, but also acetaldehyde. But winemakers, they will not make nutrient additions, yeast nutrient additions. So it predisposes wine to form some compounds. I don't think it's an excuse, but it's a reason why those wines can sometimes show those faults. It's a nice idea to blend number 8 and 9. These always occur at the same time, so that gives a really good impression of volatile acidity. So get rid of the number 8 and 9 mix. There's one sample left, which is the number 10. So go ahead and pour it, please. It smells of potato skins. But asparagus, very close follow-up. Dog soil. It smells also of peanuts or peanut butter, but mostly the shells, like the outer layers of the peanut, that really smells of this. Tahini, which is based of sesame seeds, also has that smell. And quinoa, raw before you boil it, also smells like this. Interesting list of descriptors indeed. We're talking about ladybird taint here. And wouldn't you believe that indeed those innocent-looking ladybird beetles can indeed give off a nasty off flavor to wine. So ladybirds, I think you all know what they look like. I'll show them on this slide over here on the left. That's a ladybird beetle. It's actually native to Asia, and it was introduced artificially in the United States a long time ago. And it did it because it's a natural predator of aphids, and that's pictured in the middle here. Now, aphids, they are a predator in turn of soybeans, and soybeans are pictured on the right. Now, soybeans are planted massively. So this was initially a pretty good idea, okay? So you're getting rid of some of the pests that are involved with soybean production by introducing ladybird beetles. They didn't consider the impact that it could potentially have on grapevines. So soybean harvest is typically a bit earlier than grapevine harvest. And then what happens is the aphids move away, the ladybird beetles also move away, and they tend to migrate to the vineyards looking for new food sources, either from grapes or from weeds maybe that are growing within the grapevine. And indeed, it was discovered. So this was first reported a problem in around early 2000s. In Ontario specifically, all of the wine suddenly smelled of potato skin. And they also noticed an unusual high population of ladybird beetles in the vineyard in that particular vintage. So they did a small experiment. They took some of the beetles, soaked it into a clean wine, and indeed, the wine started to smell of potato skin. Now, indeed, the effect is, if the beetles end up in your harvest and then they end up in the grape crush, they will taint your wine. They also did some calculations, and it is 1 beetle per 1.5 kilogram of grapes. And if you are passing that threshold, then you're going to get a ladybird taint in your wine. Now, I will admit this is a bit more of a niche fault. So it was 2001 in Ontario and some other regions in North America. In 2004, it was reported in Burgundy wines, and then some other vintages, there were some incidences of it. So it's something that's not very, it's one of the rarer faults. And fortunately, it's relatively easy to prevent because you can just remove the beetles during harvest and when you're harvesting or you're selecting your grapes, and that will do the trick. So it's one of the faults that may be a bit easier to prevent if you can afford to sort through your grapes. Vineyard management, you're also looking at controlling certain weeds that can potentially host aphids, and that can lead to higher populations of ladybird beetles. I think we have a little bit more. So we'll have 1 more minute left to talk about the different types of pyrazines. So pyrazines is a class of aromatic compounds, and it can basically be divided in 2 different types. Okay, there's the methoxypyrazines, and then there's the different types of pyrazines. Within methoxypyrazines, there's 2 important ones. One that smells like green bell pepper. That's a component of Cabernet Sauvignon, Sauvignon Blanc. And then the other important one is this one, what you're smelling, and that's called the ladybird taint, the isopropyl version, and that is that smells of potato skins, indeed. So, thank you so much for your attention. Just to wrap up, if you're interested in the slides, go to my website, and then on the top right, you can open the menu and go into the study materials folder. What I'll do is I'll also copy this link and I'll put it in the chat so it's a bit easier for you to access. There you go. And there you can download the PowerPoint slides if you're interested in those. If you have any more questions or would like to know other things about aroma compounds, you can always contact me via the email address mentioned here. Follow me on Instagram if you're interested. So I make weekly posts about all sort of educative stuff about wine aroma compounds in specific. And then on my website, you can also find my full event schedule where you can sign up for in-person courses, as well as future online classes. I have one coming up in June. So on the 2nd of June, we'll talk about white wine flavors, the desirable flavors found in wine. On my website, you can also access my online store where you can purchase tasting kits. So those are the samples that I used for this class as well. You can place an order there. So I'll just go through the chat. Doesn't look like there's any more questions. So yes, you're very welcome. Thanks for all the nice words, everyone. Hope to see you soon and enjoy the rest of your day.